Good morning, everyone. Good morning, our guest. I think today the Vice President of Bangladesh also is joining with us today. And this is the penultimate day of our online session, which started on 16th of April. I think you are also a little tired, we too, little bit. And because I think it went well, and you got some information from us and from the lecturers who spoke to you all during this 22 sessions. Today is the 22nd session. Today it's a very, very important session which you may feel, the microcycle. Microcycle is the most important component of a periodization, where if the microcycle planning is not all right, not correct, then your whole program will be, you can say, going abrupted. So it is a very important session. I'm sure that you will get a lot of new information from Mr. Walker Herman, the high performance director, also is the global sports consultant for sports sciences. Once again, I'm welcoming all, as well the guests from our neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Malaysia. There are some 3 participants, and from Philippines, Ms. Rosalind, Joseph, all are here. Once again, welcome you and good morning to you all. Good morning to everyone. So now I request Mr. Walker Herman to start the session on microcycle planning. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you back. As Mr. Radhakrishnan mentioned, it's a penultimate session today. We will conclude this online course by tomorrow. And as you all know, in the jumps, the takeoff actually starts at the penultimate step. That's where we begin to raise the body center of gravity, the body center of mass. So I hope that today's session will also help you to lift not your body center of mass, but your coaching performance. And at the same time, I also hope that you will be able to apply all the knowledge you've acquired during the last days on the ground as soon as possible again. So as the situation in India is evolving, that you and your families and your athletes are staying healthy, and that you can resume training. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So I hope you can all see the PowerPoint presentation. We have a little echo here. Much more. Okay, yeah. When we're talking about periodization, as Mr. Radhakrishnan introduced it yesterday already, when we're talking about structured planning of mesocycle and microcycle, we always have to decide which way we eventually have to go. And there are, of course, a lot of options which are misleading us. Yeah, if you're taking this labyrinth here, it makes no sense just to simply start working or walking into one direction. You have to think about the consequences. You have to think about the different options presented to you. And eventually we have to figure out what is the best way, which way suits our athletes the best. And that's also our responsibility as coaches. And from my experience, working in different countries with hundreds of coaches, I'm afraid that a lot of coaches, they don't think in depth about this process. Yeah, we have a lot of participants in all these international courses who have been former athletes and who are simply copy and pasting their own models, or we have other coaches who are copying training models from internationally successful athletes. But that does not give you any guarantee that it will be applicable to your own athletes as well. So over the last 5 weeks, I think we pointed out on several occasions that individualization or customization of training programs becomes of utmost importance for us. And that's something we always have to consider, yeah? That we identify the best way for our particular athletes. Just as a short summary of what Mr. Radhakrishnan mentioned yesterday already. 1 second. Yeah, we have, when we're talking about an annual plan, usually sometimes in sports science, there's a small discrepancy. Some coaches even consider like an Olympic cycle to be a macro cycle, and this macro cycle, that is the longest part of the preparation. Yeah? That's where you usually have the single, double, or triple periodization, including the different periods of training, a preparation period, a competition period, and a transition period. So every microcycle consists of these 3 different periods, and in each of these periods we have so-called training phases, and that's the general and special preparation or specific preparation. In some cases, during the competition period, we have the pre-competition and the competition phase, and then we have the transition phase, which equals the transition period as well. In these phases, then we have different so-called mesocycles, and these mesocycles usually display specific loading and recovery phases. That means we usually have a loading phase that can be, for example, 3 weeks, where we have a slightly higher or increased load, a larger volume. And these 3 weeks of loading are followed by 1 recovery week. And the recovery week does not mean we are training at all. It just means we're reducing the volume and the intensity of our training, because we know that every adaptation happens during the recovery time. Yeah, so we are training, but the adaptation, the improvement or the enhancement of our performance happens during the recovery. And as we need recovery after an intensive training session, we also need a recovery after or at the end of a so-called mesocycle to allow the proper adaptation to happen inside our athlete's body. And these mesocycles, which fulfill a specific goal or have a main objective, they again consist of so-called microcycles. And these microcycles are usually equaling 1 training week. There are 2 reasons for that. The first one is that like sports science or experience tells us that human beings have a tendency to follow a weekly cycle. That's also the reason why a 7-day week has been introduced like decades ago, maybe centuries ago. I'm not 100% sure about this. Yeah, but there is a natural tendency to follow weekly cycles in our life. And that's the reason why these microcycles usually last for 1 week as well. And another reason is that if you're following a school schedule or university or working schedule, it's also much easier for us as coaches to adjust our weekly training programs to the daily schedules, the weekly schedule our athletes have to follow apart from the training. Yeah, if you want to optimize the structure of your training, you also have to consider not only what are we doing during our training, you also have to consider additional aspects. Is there an exam phase in school, for example? Are there particular days where the athletes are already undergoing an intensive PE program in the schools? Yeah? So these are aspects we have to consider in our weekly planning as well. And then within this microcycle, we have the training sessions. That's what we've discussed last week, Friday already. And each session then consists of so-called units, but we are trying not to use more than 1 or maximum of 2 units within 1 session. So one of the most critical aspects of the microcycle is actually the so-called load management, because the load management enables your athletes to get enough recovery after a certain training session. And when we're talking about load management, in general, we are dividing into 4 categories of loads. And 1 load happens regarding the central nervous system. Yeah, that includes all the speed events, whatever kind of coordination you do, like our javelin thrower Anurani here, who is doing some balance work on the slack line. It might be technique session, and it also includes maximum strength sessions like inter and intramuscular strength training, where we reach an intensity of more than approximately 90%, because that helps us to improve the coordination in between our muscles or in between the different alpha motor neurons, which are part of a muscle. Yeah, so all this kind of training methods are affecting the central nervous system. And during the session planning, we already mentioned that any load on the central nervous system should be conducted before a load which is applying to the physical development. Yeah, so the central nervous system always precedes so-called physical load, like the conditioning, for example, regarding the strength of the endurance training. And then, in addition, we have so-called structural loads. Structural loads means that we mainly have an impact on the passive structures of our body that binds the bones, the joints, the ligaments, the tendons, in a certain way as the muscles themselves, because even muscles can get injured, as we know, and that's something we have to avoid at all costs. So better coaches usually find an ability to reduce the number of injuries during an athlete's career. And these structural loads can either be volume orientated, like in the endurance events, when you have to cover a huge mileage. Yeah, and we know that even a 1500-meter runner is usually running around 120 to 150 kilometers a week. A marathon runner has to cover at least 180 to 200 kilometers a week to be able to compete at a world-class level. So this massive amount of volume, of course, means an accumulated stress on this passive part of our system, and that's considered a structural load, which we have to consider in our training sessions as well. And in addition, of course, we have plyometrics and hurdling, or events like the javelin throw, where we have a very high impact on the ground. Some of you might remember the ground reaction forces, and that means the vertical force during our ground contact. And in the triple jump, for example, we have sometimes 13 times the body weight, which is acting on the jumping leg. In the javelin throw, I think it's up to 10 times the body weight when you're blocking, in this case, like shift ball with his left leg. Yeah, so these are massive loads, massive impacts, which also mean a structural load on the body. And in addition to the load on the central nervous system and the structural load, we have the so-called metabolic load. A metabolic load mainly affects the energy production. That means when we're talking about distance events like the marathon or race walking, in general, everything which is affecting the cardiovascular system and the different energy systems. Yeah, that includes endurance work, aerobic endurance. It includes lactic work. It includes improving the VO2 max, some speed endurance work, of course. And so these are considered to be metabolic loads. And in addition, in sports, we also have mental loads. Training always means a certain stress to the body. Yeah, and even more stress happens when it comes to competitions like, not necessarily just focused on international competitions, but also local competitions. So in general, we say competitions mean a high stress for the athlete. And that's one reason why for younger athletes, we want to reduce the amount of stress they're experiencing. That means younger athletes or developing athletes in general are competing lesser in comparison to senior athletes. So considering these different loads, we will get a brief idea of how much recovery is necessary. Yeah, and for the central nervous system, we know a load on the central nervous system requires a minimum of 48 hours, sometimes up to 72 hours, often even longer. Yeah, we know that certain training sessions, for example, if you do, or if you conduct supramaximal sprint training, that means assisted sprinting, often it takes 9 to 10 days to fully recover from such a session. And we will elaborate a bit more on this later. But in general, you can say if you have a load on the central nervous system, it requires 2 to 3 days, 48 to 72 hours of rest before we are able to conduct a similar session of the same kind. When it comes to structural loads, we usually talk about 48 hours of recovery. Metabolic loads, when they're affecting the aerobic system, requires 12 to 24 hours. Some scientists say even 8, and that's the reason why some of the African runners are conducting 3 running sessions a day. So as a rule of thumb, 12 to 24 hours of recovery for experienced top athletes, this might be reduced to 6 or 8 hours even, as long as there's no lactic acid involved and as long as we're staying below the aerobic anaerobic threshold. If you're having anaerobic loads producing a lot of lactic acid, we require again 48 to 72 hours of rest before conducting the next session of this kind. For the mental load, you cannot generalize regarding the recovery time because this is a very individual aspect. And it requires a lot of communication, interaction with the athlete to figure out whether the athlete is mentally fatigued or you can simply go ahead with another session. Yeah, but for every session you're conducting, you have to establish what is the most or the main load. Is it regarding the central nervous system or the structural system? Is it metabolic load? And what are the mental aspects? And once you figured out what is the main load, and sometimes it's actually a combination. If you conduct, for example, intensive plyometric session, let's say 6 sets of 4 vertical depth jumps. Of course, we have a load on the central nervous system because we need a high velocity as well as a high amount of coordination. At the same time, because of the vertical ground reaction forces, we also have a structural load. Yeah, so some of the loads we are implementing in our training are actually displaying a mixture of 2 of these different categories. Yeah, but in general, whatever you're conducting, whatever session you're conducting in your microcycle, it will be related to either the central nervous system, we call it CNS, the structural load, the metabolic load, and often in addition, especially when it's very challenging sessions or when it comes to competitions, we have a mental load as well. So when we are discussing our training plan, especially of course, in our focus is always the athlete. We want to improve the athlete's performance level. And I call it the planning triangle. We have 3 factors which are influencing the performance of this athlete. And this planning triangle actually helps us to identify where or on which parts we have to work on. We have the so-called athlete's predisposition, and we discussed this earlier already. Yeah, athlete's predisposition just means what is the current situation of the athlete. I will elaborate a bit more on this the next slide. We have the performance limiting factors regarding our event. Yeah, in Pio Chitra's case, for example, we have to understand what are the requirements of a 1500 meter runner, what is the basic endurance level, what is the amount of VO2 max you should acquire, how much speed training you need, how much strength training do you need. And then, in addition, we have to fulfill the objectives of our different training phases. Yeah, as Mr. Radhakrishnan introduced yesterday, every phase and every mesocycle in our annual plan, in our macrocycle, has to fulfill a specific objective. And according to this objective, of course, we have to adjust our microcycle planning as well. So this athlete's predisposition or the starting position, the performance limiting factors of the event, and the objectives of the different training phases, they are interconnected and they are depending and influencing each other. When we're talking about the athlete's profile or predisposition, yeah, you can see I took this example here. These are all 200 or 400 meter sprinters, but you can see a very, very different physical structure. We have Marie-Josée Pérec, one of the best 100 and 400 meter time runners of all time from French. She was a very tall woman, extremely long step lengths, very lean, as you can see here. On the other hand, we have Daphne Schippers from the Netherlands, former world champion on the 200 meters. She's a very powerful 4 girl. We have Veide van Nieuwkerk here, so we also have gender differences. You see Alison Felix, who again is an entirely different type of athlete. We have a former 200 meter world champion Julia from Turkey, who again is a very muscular type. So you can already see, imagine these 5 athletes would be in your training group. Yeah, of course you were a very successful and happy coach, I'm pretty sure about this, but it also means you need to find different ways for them to adjust your training. And with these 5 athletes in your training group, most likely you have to write 5 different training programs for every single day, because they're not only looking different. They're not only having a different gender, they will have a different training age. Their bodies might react in a different way to training. That means their adaptability will be different. They have a different way to recover. Yeah, and someone like Alison Felix, who is probably more prone to endurance events as well, like a 400 meters time, would have a shorter recovery time than in comparison to Daphne Skippers, who is more like a 100 and 200 meter type, more depending on her strength level. Yeah, so you have to identify what are the personal strengths, what are the personal weaknesses of these athletes, and you also have to understand about their mentality. Yeah, what are the training sessions they like, what are the training sessions they dislike. So this is just among a few factors you have to figure out with regards to your athlete's profile and predisposition. And I think we gave some hints on how to do that during the different sessions on speed training, strength training, biometrics, endurance training. We had a couple of sessions for the throws. So these all helps you hopefully to get a better understanding of your athlete, because this will enhance your training. Yeah, when we talk about age-related training, that also plays an important role when it comes to the athlete's profile. We have to understand, and this is one of the very first slides I was sharing 5 weeks ago already, that training has to become more specific with increasing age. Now, you cannot train as often and as intensive with younger athletes as we probably do that with high-performance athletes who have a so-called high training age of maybe 8 or 9 years. Yeah, we need to work on the fundamentals first to enable a specific training afterwards. And there's no shortcut to overcome or to skip the fundamental base training, because this really becomes essential for the long-term development. If our athletes don't have a strong base, a fundamental base, there's a very high chance that they will peak early and that they will not make it to a world-class level. Yeah, and again, there's a reason why so many of our Indian athletes are peaking at the age of 18 or 19, and they're dropping out at the age of 20 or even earlier from the sport, and we're losing a lot of potential, a lot of talents on the way before they even make it to the desired stage. And general contents in general provide an appreciated and necessary alternative to more specific contents, and that's also very important, allows more recovery in between intensive sessions. So if you have a better base, a stronger endurance base, it will help your athletes to shorten, to reduce the recovery time, and that, on the other hand, enables you to conduct more training sessions. Yeah, so please reconsider the structure of having 10 sessions a week with your athletes, because 10 sessions most likely will not give you the necessary recovery time. And recovery becomes the critical factor when it comes to the density of intensive sessions. Yeah, and once again, I just want to give you this example as a rule of thumb of the number of training sessions for different age groups. We know in the age of 14, 15, usually you're not training more than 4 or 5 times a week. And this number is increasing by 1 per every 2 years. Yeah, in the age of 16, 17, we are having 5 to 6 sessions. In the age of 18, 19, on general, 6 to 7, probably 1 or 2 more for the distance runners and maybe the throwers. In the age of 20 to 22, it's not more than 8 sessions in general for the sprinters or the jumpers. Probably again a few more for the middle and long distance athletes or the multi-event athletes. But what we can see, again, the amount of general training sessions stays more or less consistent throughout the career of an athlete. It might even be reduced at the end when the athlete are reaching a high performance stage and they don't have to care for the base values that much any longer. But what we need to ensure that the number of specific training sessions is slowly increasing. And that's again only necessary, or this is only possible because we are improving our recovery. And the recovery depends on what you're doing here during these 3 to 4 general sessions. But the general work will enable you to conduct more specific work, and this specific work then throughout an athlete's career becomes more and more important. And by planning our microcycle, yeah, we have to consider what is the training age, how many of this intensive or specific training sessions are our athletes able to deal with, and what will cause a potential overtraining, because that's something we have to avoid. The training always has to be adjusted, again, according to the athlete's predisposition, and that highly depends on his training stage or the training age. So then the second part of our planning triangle, these are the so-called performance limiting factors. And these are, of course, very different in between the different disciplines. Yeah, if you compare 1500-meter runners with a marathon, there are already huge differences. If you compare a marathon runner with a discus thrower, the differences even increase. And a discus thrower to a hurdler, everybody directly sees, okay, there are obviously a lot of different aspects as well. So we need to, and we've discussed this earlier, discuss how much speed training do we need in our event, how much strength, endurance, and flexibility do we require. So that means the biomotor abilities have to be considered. And again, this will be different. Yeah, a 1500-meter runner needs more speed training than a marathon runner. They might also need more strength training than a marathon runner. A marathon runner, on the other hand, needs a better base endurance, a higher critical velocity or a higher anaerobic threshold. And when it comes to flexibility, it might be more or less the same for both of them. When we're talking about a hurdler, of course, they need more speed, they need more strength, they even need more reactive strength in comparison to a discus thrower. They might need more coordination or technique training than a distance runner. There will be tactical events, which in the middle distance events are pretty much important. In the discus throw, probably not that much. Of course, we have to adjust the angle of release to the wind conditions. You might have some throwers who are better in the first attempts rather than the last attempt. So these are also tactical aspects, but very different from what we need in the 1500-meter or long distance events, yeah, or in the 400-meter hurdles. How is your race pattern looking like? So these are all things we have to figure out, and we have to understand, are we able to approach them in training? Are they trainable? If we're able to affect these factors in training, of course, we have to implement them in our plan. Yeah, and this again applies to all biomotor abilities. We've discussed this earlier already. We need to understand how much speed, strength, endurance, flexibility, and motor skills are necessary. And step by step, we need to develop this profile of our events as well. And then the last part of the planning triangle is the so-called training phase. Yeah, we have the different phases: general preparation, followed by a special preparation. In some cases, with high performance athletes, a so-called specific preparation, which is the link between the special preparation and the pre-competition. Yeah, and this 2 or 3, they form the preparation period. And then we have the pre-competition and the competition phase, which form the competition period. And all of these periods or phases, they follow a certain objective. Sometimes it might be to develop a biomotor ability. In other cases, it might be to maintain them. For example, we know that in pre-competition or competition phase, we do not really want to focus on maximum strength training any longer. Because if you focus on maximum strength, if you try to make your athletes stronger and you improve the speed at the same time, there's always a very high risk of injuries. Yeah, so in general, try to avoid a combination of maximum strength and maximum velocity speed training, because there's a very high risk for hamstring injuries or other muscle injuries. So we know, okay, in general and special preparation, we are developing our maximum strength, and then from pre-competition phase onwards, be able to just maintain it. And maintenance requires a lesser amount of training session in comparison to development. Yeah, you might have to conduct 2 or 3 sessions a week to develop maximum strength. Maybe 1 session a week or even 1 session every second week is enough to maintain the strength level. Yeah, so we have different objectives, and sometimes it's about developing these abilities. Some periods are more for maintaining them. Yeah, in special preparation or pre-competition, we're trying to develop our technique. In pre-competition or competition, it's almost too late to develop technique any longer, so we just wait for the accumulation and we try to maintain a decent technical level. The duration of the different phases also plays an important role. How long does it take take to develop certain abilities. Yeah, and this is usually linked to the length of the different phases. If you, for example, know it takes approximately 8 weeks for your athlete to develop a decent maximum strength level, you know, okay, your general preparation should follow this 8 weeks. In the endurance events, for example, in the marathon, some coaches know, okay, it takes around 16 weeks to develop a decent aerobic level or a decent VO2 max. So you have to adjust the length of your phases, the general preparation, special preparation, according to the required durations, the required time you need to develop the objectives. And that, of course, has an influence on the volume, the intensity, and the recovery as well. In general preparation, as Mr. Radhakrishnan pointed out yesterday, we might have a higher volume. Closer to the competitions, we show a higher intensity. Yeah, but you cannot have high volume and a high intensity at the same time, because this will, again, increase the potential risk of injuries. So each phase, yeah, the general preparation phase, special preparation phase, or specific preparation phase, pre-competition and competition phase, they have different requirements regarding the objectives, the development or maintenance. They neither require different duration, and we're dealing with a different volume, intensity, and recovery in these different phases. And that's something you need to know to understand, again, your planning triangle a bit better. And here we have a short overview regarding the progression throughout the year. Again, it might be a bit different for certain events. This progression applies more to the sprint and jumping events, maybe in certain ways to the throws as well. For the endurance athletes, it has to be slightly adjusted. Yeah, but if you think of the first column here as what you're doing in general preparation, the second one is what you do in special preparation, and the last one is what you do in pre-competition phase. You see throughout the season, there's always a development. What we're doing in general preparation is different from what we're doing in special preparation, and that's different from what we're doing in the pre-competition phase. Yeah, so usually we start the season, for example, with some acceleration work before we slowly transit into sub-maximum velocity sprinting. And in pre-competition phase, focus, of course, has to be on maximum velocity sprinting or having fast run-ups with a full approach. When it comes to technique or coordination, we usually start with simple aspects of the technique or technical details. Yeah, remember the chaining method, that we are breaking the technique down into details. Afterwards, in special preparation, we are combining these details into more complex aspects or so-called technical sequences. And latest in pre-competition phase, we have to adjust our fine model coming close to a mastery level. When it comes to strength, we develop maximum strength first, followed by power or speed strength, and that in a high performance sport is followed by so-called reflective strength. That's something we have not discussed in this course, but that's something you might probably learn during your level 2 education, which AFI is offering regularly. When it comes to plyometrics, that's something we discussed in depth. We start with isometric landing-oriented jumps before transiting into repetitive vertical or horizontal jumps. And then in pre-competition, we focus on reactive depth jumps or speed bounding. And the same applies to the endurance events as well. We start usually building an aerobic base. We are trying to get a right shift of our lactic acid curve in combination with an increased VO2 max, maximum oxygen consumption. Later, we focus a bit more on special endurance if this is required. And last but not least, we focus on speed or speed endurance at the later part of the pre-competition phase. That's, by the way, a very important aspect we often neglect. It does not make sense to develop speed endurance, and speed endurance usually applies to a duration of 8 to 20 seconds. It does not make sense to conduct intensive speed endurance sessions before the pre-competition phase, because if you want to affect speed endurance, we need to increase or improve our speed first, because speed endurance simply means we want to maintain our maximum running velocity. So if you start doing speed endurance training before you affect the maximum velocity, you will maintain a sub-maximum velocity, and that definitely does not help you with the objective of your session. So always conduct speed training first, and then usually at the second part of the pre-competition phase, that's where we add a bit of speed endurance training to our training sessions as well to maintain the maximum velocity. But if you train speed endurance without developing speed, we mainly train endurance, and that does not really help us. It will probably help us to develop 10.4, 100-meter sprinters, but definitely not to develop 10.0 sprinters or long jumpers or whatever. So here, regarding this progression, I just share a general overview with you how an annual plan as introduced by our deputy chief coach yesterday can look like. Yeah, here we see, okay, we have a general preparation and we have different objectives for this general preparation. And usually these objectives should not be more than 2, probably a maximum of 3. Yeah, in general preparation here, and this is for a sprint group, Coach Nagesh was luckily sharing this information with us. We have some maximum strengths, yeah, that you want to focus. We have short acceleration ones. That usually means below 45 meters. And we're working on the aerobic endurance, even with our sprinters, to reduce the necessary recovery time. We have an 8-week general preparation phase, followed by a 6-week special preparation phase. And you can see the focus in special preparation is slightly shifting towards we maintaining as a maximum strength, but we go for longer acceleration ones. It means up to 60 meters, and we do a bit of special endurance training. And this again is followed by a pre-competition phase. So this is followed by a pre-competition phase, which takes often like 3 to 4 weeks. And here you can see now the focus is solely on speed training. Second. And this pre-competition phase then of course is followed by a competition phase where again the focus is on speed development and speed endurance in the second half. What you can see here now in this column is the so-called load. What we are using with some coaches is that we allocate different loads, overall loads, to the different training weeks. And you can see the load is always increasing. That means we have a small decline in the load structure, again followed by 1 recovery week. So a load number 2 means it's a medium load, 3 is a high load, 4 is a very high load. And 1 means recovery week. So you can see here, we always have 3 weeks of increased loading followed by a recovery week. And again, 3 weeks of very high load followed by 1 recovery week. And I can just encourage you to use these recovery weeks. I know it's not that common in India, or a lot of coaches are using recovery weeks only maybe after 9 to 10 weeks of training, but have the courage to give or to provide more rest to your athletes, because again, all the adaptation happens during the rest lengths. And when you have a recovery week where instead of maybe 7 or 8 training sessions, you're only conducting 4 or 5, it will definitely help your athletes to show a higher compensation of the training, to show a higher adaptation. That means the next mesocycle, they can directly start on a slightly higher level. Yeah, and this is what I mentioned earlier. These first 4 weeks are considered to be 1 mesocycle, and then we have a second mesocycle in the same phase. In special preparation, when we know the load becomes a bit more intense, that means we need even more recovery, we are shortening the duration of these mesocycles. So instead of 3 weeks of loading and 1 week of recovery, here we only have 2 weeks of loading followed by 1 week of recovery. Still we have 2 mesocycles, but again, overall with more rest. And when it comes to pre-competition, we're usually not following this inclined model. We're following a more like a pyramid, that the load is going up and then gradually decreasing towards the competition phase. And here on the right-hand side, then you can find the different contents or the main training methods for the different phases in the general preparation, according, of course, to the main objectives. But the most important aspect is you need to understand where are your athletes right now, what are the performance requirements, and what do you want to develop during the different training phases, or what are the objectives of these phases. And that together again brings us back to our planning triangle. Yeah, we have the athlete's predisposition. Where are we at right now? What are the strengths and weaknesses of our athletes? We have the performance limiting factors, so we know more or less what do we have to achieve in our training, yeah, according to these strengths and weaknesses. And we know about the objectives of our training phase. Yeah, that the objectives in general preparation, as you could see here, are different from the one in special preparation or from pre-competition. So if we take all these three aspects into consideration, we have to look for a merger. Yeah, and this point here, the, the part where all these three circles are overlapping at this triangle, that's where our training has to happen. And we have to ensure that this overlapping area over the years are getting wider and wider, because as bigger this overlapping is, as more successful will our athletes be. And we need to get the athletes closer to the performance limiting factors, and we have to adjust our training phases according to the predisposition and the performance limiting factors. And once this triangle is increasing, our performance in competition will also be enhanced. So now the next step is we start with a microcycle construction. So we have to develop this planning triangle, yeah, again, regarding the athlete's predisposition, regarding the performance limiting factors, and we need to understand about the specific objectives in our training. And the second step for us will be to identify the key sessions. For example, I mentioned that in a pre-competition phase for sprinters or jumpers, usually the focus is on speed or on fast jumps with a huge approach, almost as in competition. So we know, okay, the speed session for us is a key session, and that's what we do in general preparation. The key session might be a strength session or an aerobic endurance session. So we have to identify these key sessions. That means the most important training sessions in our microcycle, because later onwards we will start planning our training week around these key sessions. You always start identifying and planning the key sessions first, and then step by step you add the less important sessions or the sessions which have a lower priority afterwards. Yeah, we need to determine the number of sessions. We know, for example, when it comes to speed training, we need 72 hours of recovery before we can able to conduct a second speed session. That means on average, we're not able to conduct more than 2 speed sessions in 1 week. Yeah, when you conduct a strength training session, you know, okay, the recovery time here is a bit shorter. So we can probably have 3 or even 4 strength sessions in 1 week, if this is your most important session, yeah, your objective. And afterwards, we have to distribute the load. We need to understand what kind of load are we dealing with. Is it a load on the central nervous system? Is it a structural load? Or is it a metabolic load? Because this load distribution then helps us to understand about the necessary recovery time. How much time, how many days, how many hours do we need before we're able to conduct the next training session or same training session of a similar load. Yeah, afterwards, we need to identify the main training methods. So if you know you want to improve the speed, which training method are you using? Yeah, or if you want to develop strength, which is a training method? Do you want to use a hypertrophic training, or you want to use intramuscular training? Do you want to do power training, or is it probably becoming a plyometric session? So this is the next session. What methods do you use or utilize to improve your key session or the biomotor ability, considering the respective load? And that, of course, includes the establishment of intensity, volume, and recovery as well. And once you fix this, we can go ahead constructing our daily sessions. And lastly, we're going to evaluate this microcycle. Yeah, like after every training session, but also after every training meet, you should check whether actually the training went ahead as you planned it. So Okay, sorry, short technical problem. Yeah, so when we're talking about microcycle construction, always develop this planning triangle, get a good understanding of your athlete, the performance limiting factor, and the objectives of the season. Then we identify the key sessions, we determine the number, the load, we identify the training method, we establish intensity, volume, and recovery. And based on this information, we're constructing our daily sessions. And on a daily basis, once you go home after training and every Saturday afternoon, once you finish your training week or Sunday, evaluate what you've been doing to get a good understanding whether you can go ahead or whether you have to repeat probably a few things of the aspects of the sessions you've done before. So now we're back to the annual plan, and I just want to give you another example how to do that. Yeah, we mentioned we need to understand our planning triangle. What is the objective? So the example I want to give you now is based, for example, on special preparation. And here we know the focus is on maximum strength. We're going to do some acceleration work, slightly longer. That means we might even include a bit of speed training. And we will do a bit of special endurance training too. Yeah, and then we have to check, okay, right now we are in the 12th week of training. That means a week after a recovery week. That means our athlete will be pretty fit when they're coming back to the Monday session. And we have a high load. Yeah, 4 means the highest load after a recovery week. So this is the information we need as coaches. Yeah, we know about the training week, we know about the phase, we need to know about the objective, and we know, okay, this week is going to be a week with a high load. And that's the way we start planning. This is a general template we're using with most of our national athletes. And I think we can upload this as well, so you can also use it. And the information we are requiring is according to the different days. Yeah, we have the dates, we have the main objective of the sessions. Then we have a row for the warm-up. So what kind of warm-up do we want to use for the different sessions? So, because remember, every warm-up has to fulfill a specific target. And then we have the content, including volume, intensity, and recovery, and the main load, yeah, whether it's a load on the central nervous system, on the structural system, the metabolic system, or whether mental load is involved. And we have this for morning and for afternoon sessions. And here you can already see that I started with the first step. Yeah, after the planning triangle, I already introduced 2 speed sessions. Yeah, 1 speed session on Monday morning, focuses on acceleration. And we know, okay, after Monday, we need around 3 days of rest. So 3 days, it means on Thursday, we can conduct the next speed session. Personally, I decided to give 1 more day of rest to the athletes. Yeah. So we've conducted our speed sessions now on Monday and Friday. You cannot conduct a speed session on Monday and Tuesday because, again, this speed session is a high load on the central nervous system. That means a high intensity, and that requires at least 3 days of rest. Yeah, so if you know, okay, the first speed session happens on Monday, you need to count Monday plus 72 hours, and that means, okay, first day to have another intensive speed session might be on Thursday. But again, in this case, we just chose to provide the athlete another day of rest, so the next speed session happens on Friday. Yeah, and speed here is our key session, so that's how we start fixing the training program. Then in addition, we know, okay, one of the objectives was to develop strengths. Not necessarily, the athletes did a lot of maximum strength in general preparation, so here we do only 1 maximum strength session, and we will put it immediately after the Monday morning session. Yeah, that's something you can definitely combine, as mentioned in the session planning. That you do some acceleration, like 4 times 40 meter out of the blocks or something like that in the morning, followed by a maximum strength session in the afternoon. And the next morning, we just use some power or speed strength in combination with some plyometrics as a kind of utilization. So then the next objective was special endurance. Yeah, we don't want to do a lot of it, so these sessions are relatively short, but you can see, okay, special endurance on Wednesday, and that's another reason why we put the next speed session on Friday, because after a day of special endurance that you build, even if it's a little bit of lactic acid, the next day, you should not conduct any session with a load on the central nervous system. So keep this in mind. The day after a lactic session is reserved for recovery, active rest, or aerobic training. Yeah, try to avoid any load on the central nervous system the day after a lactic acid session. We want to have one short one here and one slightly longer one, ins and outs. So again, remember, within or in between lactic acid sessions, we want to have another at least 48, if possible, 72 hours of rest. And if you put one session on Wednesday, the other one on Saturday, we exactly have the 72 hours of rest. And we can also guarantee that the athletes have a recovery day on Thursday before having a second speed session. Yeah, and as mentioned earlier, we're using the recovery day to have some kind of active recovery. That means aerobic capacity on Thursday. And that gives us a very decent weekly structure. Yeah, and you can see that actually also with world-class athletes, they often following so-called clusters. And we have one cluster here, yeah, followed by speed, strength, and endurance. And the same would apply here. Speed, now the strength part is missing because we're in special preparation already, but speed followed by endurance. So we have two clusters. First one with loading and the small recovery, aerobic capacity as a part of recovery training here, followed by the second cluster. Yeah, but a very typical approach for speed-related events, the sprints, the jumps, even the throws, that we have speed work, power work, endurance work, and then again, speed, power, endurance, so that we break down the microcycle into two of these clusters, always following the speed, power, endurance planning. And that seems to be very fine also for world-class athletes. The Sunday then is a rest day. Yeah, so once this is done, we have to think about the load. And of course, we know when we're affecting the central nervous system, we always have a load on the central speed, or means load on the central nervous system. Maximum strength, since we want to avoid hypertrophy, also means load on the central nervous system and some structural load. Special endurance, here in this case, is also some load on the central nervous system, but also mainly metabolic load. Aerobic capacity is also metabolic load. Before we come back to load on the central nervous system, and special endurance then again becomes metabolic load mainly. Yeah, once this is done, we have to establish the different training methods. And we have several methods we can use, and always ensure that you're not sticking only to one method, because we want to keep the variety in training a bit higher. Yeah, just to show you a few examples. If you want to do speed training, that means you can do short acceleration runs, you can do longer acceleration runs, you can do ins and outs, sub-maximum speed work at around 90 to 95% maximum speed. 95 to 98% maximum speed at 98% and higher. You can do some resistance work, super maximal sprint work. If it comes to strength, you can do hypertrophy, intermuscular, intramuscular, isometric, eccentric, power training. When it comes to plyometrics, it means isometric jumps, repetitive vertical or horizontal jumps, depth jumps, speed bounding, just to name a few amongst them. When it comes to endurance, you can do continuous runs, fartleks, extensive intervals, special endurance 1 or 2 training, speed endurance. So these are all aspects, and I hope that you remember that we've discussed over the last weeks. Yeah, and that's the reason why we're conducting this planning session at the end of the course, because by now you should have a very decent overview about all the different training methods regarding the different biomotor abilities or regarding the technique. Yeah, so you have to figure out which training method do you want to use in your microcycle. Again, that depends a bit on your athlete's profile, the performance limiting factors, and also the training period or training phase you are in right now. And then the next step was to describe the so-called load normatives. Yeah, how much load is required? And load always depends either on intensity, volume, which often equals duration, and the recovery time. And the recovery time directly determines the training frequency. Yeah, training frequency means, for example, if you know you have 72 hours of rest, you can have a frequency of one speed session every 3 days. If you have 48 hours rest, when it comes to strength training, for example, you know, okay, you can have one strength session every second day. If you have general endurance for a highly trained athlete, you know, okay, it's only 8 hours rest, so you can have 2 to 3 sessions every day. Yeah, so volume and recovery or training frequency also equals the density of your training. And keep in mind, if you want to increase the intensity, yeah, we also have to increase the recovery time. That means more intensive training sessions require a longer recovery time. At the same time, a high intensity directly means we have to reduce our training volume. And if you have to reduce the volume, in most of the cases, we have to reduce the frequency as well. So if you have a higher volume, like a continuous run, for example, yeah, again, you can conduct 2 continuous runs each day if you want to. The high structural load, but your body, the metabolic system, will still be able to cope with that, still able to manage it. Yeah, but a higher intensity, and for the speed events, that means the jumps, the throws, the sprints, intensity equals quality, and quality should be in our focus. Higher quality requires more recovery. And that means we need to reduce the volume and we need to reduce the frequency of our training. So please reconsider this average of 10 training sessions with your athletes, which we find regularly on Indian tracks and gyms, yeah, because it's too much, especially if you want to focus on quality. And again, I've mentioned this earlier, but I can guarantee you that there are world-class sprinters or jumpers who only training 5 or 6 times a week. Yeah, because it's not about the volume in these cases. The volume can actually be very low because this reduced volume enables us to get more recovery, and that helps us to reach a higher intensity. Again, if you're a middle and long distance runner or race walker, we need a certain volume because we have to have this right shift of the lactate curve. Yeah, as well, we want to increase the VO2 max. That means we need more volume. We need a higher frequency of our training sessions. And that means we need to reduce the intensity. You cannot go all out every single day as a distance runner because this will definitely cause an overtraining and it will disable you to reach the necessary volume, which you mentioned, of around 140, 150 kilometers for a 1500 meter run in general preparation, or 180 to sometimes 240 kilometers for a marathon run. Yeah, higher intensity requires more recovery and reduced volume as well as reduced training frequency. Yeah, what I mentioned already, always keep this in mind that strength multiplied by coordination and technique equals speed and power, and that becomes a limiting factor when it comes to the quality of our training. And quality for us, except the distance events, is more important than quantity. So once you've done all this, yeah, you come to the eventual training program. And again, that's a program you can find for the 100 meter sprinters, for example. Yeah, just to have a look on the Monday, we know speed and acceleration. You construct the warm-up accordingly. Yeah, and you can find here a hamstring and gluteus activation, for example, back extensor activation. Prepare the body, conducting a few drop jumps before doing some block starts. In the afternoon, and we know here you can see this is a load on the central nervous system. Yeah, in the afternoon you have a strength training, some power, only very little bit, 3 sets, 3 to 4 sets, followed by some plyometrics as a kind of utilization of the day before, and then some technique work, easy technique work. It's the day afterwards where we have a load on the metabolic system, and so on. Yeah, as introduced earlier, So you can see very specific planning for every single day of the microcycle. That means we also have a very specific plan for every single day of our annual plan. Yeah, a proper coach already has in October has a very good idea of what is he going to do in February or March and April. Of course, we have to stay open-minded since we have to adjust our training program from time to time. Yeah, we cannot skip any of these development steps. And if you see that in special preparation, the strength level of your athlete is still not high enough, you might have to increase the length of your general preparation. That means you have to sacrifice some of your special preparation or pre-competition phase, or you have to shorten your competition period. Yeah, but with some experience, you usually find a very good way to determine the length of the different phases and to structure the training accordingly. And even so, maybe one other example, this is a plan for one group, but you see a lot of differentiation at almost every day, that the program is slightly different for the different athletes, and even the load is different for the different athletes. And some of you might ask themselves, hey, if you're only supposed to have a load on the central nervous system every 3 days, how are you able to conduct a speed session on Monday and then a power or reactive strength session on Tuesday? Yeah, and the reason for this is when training sessions with different objectives and varying demands follow each other, it may not be necessary to wait for complete recovery. So we know we have a speed session here and we need 72 hours of recovery. That's the reason why the next speed session only happens on Friday. In the meanwhile, of course, you still have to address some of the other objectives. And here we have a load on the central nervous system as well, yeah, on Tuesday, for example. But this load is affecting a different motor program than the load on Monday. It would not be possible, or it would not make sense to have another speed session immediately after the day of acceleration on Monday. Yeah, but to do a bit of strength work, some plyos, it's definitely possible. But you should avoid a situation where you have more than 2 days of consecutive loads on the central nervous system, even if they're affecting different motor programs in a row. So the third day and fourth day then should definitely be a rest for the central nervous system before you start your second cluster, central nervous system, strength and metabolic again. So there are a few construction rules when we're talking about the microcycles. And one of the most important is that and that applies to all training sessions, that we have to avoid accumulated fatigue. And we have to avoid having same or similar demands in successive units. You cannot have speed training on Monday and Tuesday. You cannot do technique training on Thursday and Friday, for example. Yeah, we need to have a certain variety, and we need to avoid this accumulated fatigue, especially for these events which are speed orientated. Again, the sprints, the jumps, and the throws. Because we need to reach a high quality in our training requires a decent recovery, and decent recovery is the opposite of accumulated fatigue. So avoid a situation where you're trying to achieve a high quality in your training, but your athlete is still in a process of recovering from a preceding training session. If your athlete is still fatigued from Monday, you should not have another intensive session on Tuesday, because you will not be able to reach a high intensity, a high quality of your training any longer. You can only achieve this high quality, the high standards in your training, if your athletes are at least 95, 97% recovered. If you start a session at a 90% recovery level, there's a high chance that after the session they're down to 80%. And if you continue doing it like this, yeah, you might fatigue them more and more, and that is the best way to overtrain the athletes. We also have to keep the variation high in our training, not only in the microcycle, that again applies to the whole training year, but especially in the microcycle, we should ensure that we're choosing different exercises to avoid monotony. Yeah, that helps us with the adaptation and also makes our training more enjoyable to the athletes, and they will probably develop a slightly higher motivation if they are able to experience different exercises, different training methods, instead of following the same training regime over and over again. Yeah, provide sufficient recovery, and this will also change throughout the career. Remember, our 15-year-old athletes is probably able to conduct only 1 intensive sessions a week, but 3 or 4 general sessions. But every 2 years, as a rule of thumb, we can increase the number of intensive sessions, and that is because of increased recovery. Yeah, so what happens, or what's probably applicable to the in the age of 19 might not work in the age of 22 anymore. So you constantly have to review your microcycles to see whether it's working out, or whether you can probably shorten the recovery times, or maybe you have to extend them. You constantly have to update these microcycles. Yeah, and we need to improve the recovery mechanisms during an athlete's career. Keep in mind, we only want to affect the central nervous system when the athletes are fully recovered, due to the reasons I mentioned earlier. And always avoid intensive training sessions the day after anaerobic lactic loads. Yeah, because these anaerobic lactic loads definitely have a negative impact on your recovery, and your athletes might need a bit longer. So usually we say the only session you are supposed to conduct the day after an anaerobic lactic load is some aerobic exercises or core strengths or recovery in general. Yeah, aerobic sessions, again, to get rid of these waste products, to increase the blood flow, and to work on your recovery mechanisms. But avoid or step back from having a maximum strength session, a maximum strength. A maximum, you have to mute yourself. Avoid from maximum strength session or speed sessions the day after a lactic load. There's one exception, and that's something you can probably do at the end of special at the end of pre-competition, that you conduct 2 lactic loads on consecutive days. But the idea here is to prepare the athletes for competition situation, yeah, where you have heats, semifinals, finals, often within 48 hours. But again, you don't need more than probably 2 or 3 of these combined sessions to prepare the athletes. Apart from that, you should always, in general preparation, special preparation, avoid such a situation that you have any intensive load the day after lactic load. Yeah, and we've already discussed this during the session planning, but the same again applies to the microcycle as well. We plan, we conduct, we check, and then we adjust. Yeah, and if you see things are not working out as planned, don't just go ahead with the next plan. We need to identify the main cause of a potential problem. Yeah, figure out the problem before you start replanning. A lot of coaches, they are stuck in this so-called sub-loop of planning, conducting, checking, and adjusting. You need to identify here what is the main problem, and you have to solve this before you adjust your plan. Yeah, and again, this identify the individual patterns of recovery and adaptation, which we've discussed last week, Friday, will also help you not only to improve the quality of your session, but the quality of your microcycle as well. And ask your athletes to have a training protocol, yeah, where they, on a daily basis, write down the RPE, the rate of perceived exertion, before and after the session, write down the quality of the session, and maybe you can do it yourself as a coach too, so that you can compare how are your athletes rating the session, how do you rate the sessions. And if you do this on a regular basis, yeah, usually we find similar certain patterns of recovery. Yeah, it's always following these waveforms. And if you do it over a longer period of time, maybe 5-6 weeks, you will see that these waveforms in many cases are following your microcycle. And that shows you, okay, obviously athlete number A, 2 days after an intensive strength session, he's always down. Another athlete might be down 3 days after a strength session. Another athlete might be down a day after a special endurance session. Yeah, so you can see where are the ups and downs, and that gives you a brief understanding about your athlete's ability to recover and to adjust. Yeah, avoid monotony in your training. That's what we've discussed. And I just want to give you a very brief example. This is a strength training protocol, for example, of a female 800-meter runner who was doing a deep squat in this case. And the training program she did in general preparation was a kind of intermuscular training. She did 10 repetitions, followed by 8 repetitions, followed by 6 repetitions. And you can see the blue line equals the weight she was using for the 8, the orange line for the 10 repetitions blue, 8 repetitions is orange, 6 repetitions is the green line. And you can always see that these curves, and it's actually not only regarding strength training, it's the same regarding endurance training or speed training. When we're talking about adaptations, they are always following the so-called asymptotical path. Yeah, so we have a huge improvement in the beginning, often by 10% from the first session to the second. But as more you train, as lesser is actually the performance improvement. That means the ratio between input and output. Input is the training load, and output is the adaptation. And as coaches, of course, we are interested in a very high output, that we have a huge performance improvement from one session to the other. And if you see that your athletes after a certain time are plateauing here, yeah, and this usually happens, that depends a bit on the experience of the athlete. It usually happens after 6 to 12 sessions of a similar content, that our athletes reach this plateau. If you see that the athletes are reaching this plateau, you know as a coach, okay, now it's time for us to change a few things. And there are 2 things you can change. First, you can change the exercise. So instead of a deep squat, for example, that you say, okay, now we're using a single leg squat to have a different stimulus. And then hopefully, if you start doing single leg squats from here, the curve again will look like this. Yeah, and again, after maybe another 8 sessions, you will see, okay, single leg squats are not helping us any longer. So instead, now we're doing box steps, something like that. The other thing you might consider if your athletes are plateauing is that you change the training method. So instead of intermuscular strength training, like this 10-8-6 repetitions, we might change to intramuscular strength training, doing 6-4-2-2 repetitions. Yeah, again, it's a goal to have a better ratio of input and output. Yeah, but keep in mind, as soon as you see that your athletes are plateauing, it's time to adjust the load, either regarding the exercises or regarding the training methods you are using. And this overview also helps us to determine the length of our different training phases. Yeah, general preparation is usually a bit longer because you know it takes more time to develop maximum strengths, to develop aerobic capacity. The special preparation, where the focus is on speed or special endurance for the 400-meter run, is usually a bit shorter because you know it's faster, or your athletes are adapting to this kind of loads a bit faster. But again, this also depends on the training age and the general predisposition of the athlete. And then, according to World Athletics, we also have a microcycle checklist, which helps you with the evaluation. Just ask yourself these questions: are content and structure appropriate for the athlete's development stage? Is the content appropriate for the period and the phase? Is the loading level appropriate? Are we overstressing our athletes, or are we properly underloading them if you're not prescribing enough training? Is there a sufficient balance of load and recovery and enough time for adaptation? Are the loadings actually appropriately specific to achieve our objectives? Yeah, if you want to improve the speed, we know we want a high intensity, and that means we need a long rest time. If you do 30-meter flying with a young sprinter, you can easily give them 10 to 12 minutes rest in between the repetitions. But we know that a lot of coaches, if they do 30-meter flying, they're giving them 3-4 minutes rest. So, and I can guarantee you that 3 or 4 minutes rest is not enough time to improve the speed. Yeah, the times will increase from run to run. That means we're not affecting speed any longer, but we're affecting speed endurance. Yeah, and that makes it inappropriate because we're not achieving our objective to improve the speed. Only if you give enough recovery to the athletes, and when it comes to speed training, that means quite a lot. Yeah, we're actually improving the speed and we're achieving thereby the objective of our pre-competition phase, for example. Then we need to ensure that there is enough variety within the sessions and in between the sessions. And we have to ensure that all the biomotor abilities are integrated. Yeah, even a world-class long jumper has to from time to time affect the endurance level to ensure there is sufficient recovery. And we need to ensure that especially the strength training sessions are utilized, and we need to avoid any interference between the different biomotor abilities. And that's one reason, we've discussed this in one of the previous sessions as well, that you should never combine maximum strength training and endurance session in one and the same session, yeah, or even at the same day. So always try to separate maximum strength and endurance training, because they are both relying on a protein synthesis, and this, if you affect both of them in one session, it might actually be counterproductive. The same, do not combine speed and endurance in one session, because speed has a very high impact on the central nervous system. You're trying to achieve short ground contact times. If you're doing speed training first, followed by endurance training, most likely your speed training session was a waste of time, because the body then will get used to the long ground contact times and the low velocities at the end of the session, rather than the speed work at the beginning of the session. Yeah, so use these 9 questions to check your microcycle, whether there's some space for optimization. And then we're almost done. I want to, because there were a couple of questions yesterday, shortly talk about tapering and peaking.
Mr. Walker, can I just invite President before starting the question session? Is it finished? No.
No, not yet.
I'm sorry.
But if he has to leave, he can start. He can. Yeah, it's only 2 more slides, I think. So tapering and peaking. When it comes to tapering and peaking, what you have to keep in mind is that we cannot do that for every competition. Yeah, tapering and peaking is usually a process where we reduce the volume, where we reduce the intensity, and you should not do that for a minor competition, yeah, like a build-up competition. You have to taper and peak for the most important, or maybe the 2 most important competitions in your season. Let's say the World Championships or Olympic Games. And what you have to keep in mind, also in the competition phase, the purpose here is not to train any longer, but to wait for the accumulation of all the biomotor abilities, of all the loads you've described before that. And when we're talking about tapering and peaking, and that usually means the last 10 to 14 days before competition, we usually reduce the volume. That means the number of training sessions by approximately 10 to 15%. So if you're conducting 6 sessions, you break it down to 5. If you're conducting 8 sessions, you break it down to 7. If you're having 10 sessions, maybe instead you're doing 7 or 8 now. Yeah, and at the same time, we're reducing the volume of a single session, the duration of a single session, and that's what we'll be doing by 30 to 40%. Yeah, so we're reducing the number of training sessions by 10 to 15%, but we're trying to shorten every of our single sessions by approximately 30 to 40%. And that means that the overall load during this tapering and peaking period is going down by approximately 40 to 60% in comparison to a loading phase like in general or special preparation. And the intensity has to be adjusted according to the athlete, the gender and age differences. When it comes to strength training, for example, a lot of female athletes, they like to have a small peak in their weight training, even 5 days or 8-9 days before the competition. And that's something you really have to figure out. As a rule of thumb, especially for the speed events, again, we have a 9 or 10-day rule. And that means that we're conducting the last intensive session 9 or 10 days before the main competition. But because of this reduced volume, yeah, it makes it very clear that we cannot taper and peak for every single competition. We have to focus this to 1 or 2 main competitions, because otherwise you simply would not be able to train enough. And here is an overview of a recent article by Haugen, which was published a few weeks ago. And some of you might know Charlie Francis. Charlie Francis is a very renowned sprints coach from Jamaica. He's also the coach of Asafa Powell. And he is, for example, following this 10-day rule. And I can guarantee you, if you talk to the top coaches, I would say at least 80% are following this 9 or 10-day rule. Dan Pfaff in the United States, again, most of the Jamaican coaches, US coaches, a lot of European coaches. And if you see this overview, you can see that's the last very intensive lactic session. And what he did here, 80, 100, 120, 150 meter flying, that means add another 20 to 30 meters of acceleration. This last intensive session takes place 9 or 10 days before the competition. And this is usually followed even either the day afterwards or with the day of rest, with an aerobic maintenance session. Yeah, like they are doing on the grass 10 times 220 meter tempo runs. That means at around 70, 75% with 100 meter walking in between. So relatively easy session just to maintain the aerobic capacity. And this usually happens 6 to 8 days before the competition. And then we have another last short speed session, 4 to 6 days before the competition. Often this happens on the Monday before competition, followed by a power maintenance. It means speed strength maintenance 3 to 4 days before the competition. And a pre-tensing sessions 1 or 2 days before the competition. Yeah, you can see here they're doing 4 times 30 meter from the blocks at 95% just to have some kind of pre-tensing. And Asafa Powell was resting the day before competition. But this pre-tensing really depends on your athletes. Some athletes, they prefer to do it the day before the competition. Some athletes prefer to do it 2 days before the competition. And I would like to suggest that you try that with your athletes. Yeah, it might actually change throughout the career as well. Very young athletes who are only training 4 or 5 times, often they prefer to have a day off before the competition, as you can see it here. Yeah, that was an overview we've developed for the 2020 season, which unfortunately did not happen so far. Yeah, but you can see there was a Grand Prix scheduled for Sunday, 29th March, and the athletes had a day off on Saturday and did some pre-tensing on Friday. So that was the idea, and that's something usually the young athletes like to have, a day off before the day of competition. But if you have an athlete with a high training age who is used to a slightly higher volume, and we don't want to reduce the number of overall sessions too much because the body energy will actually be reduced. And what we're doing here, you're doing some pre-tensing the day before. But again, this is a very individual process, and it's something you should try with your athletes. And that's what we wanted to do with some of the national athletes as well. Yeah, that we had 3 Grand Prix, and for each of these Grand Prix, we wanted to try a different pre-tensing strategy. Here for the first Grand Prix, a normal pre-tensing with some very extensive intervals, very easy. For example, 2 sets of 3 by 200. Very simple, combined with some core strings, do some pre-tensing the day before, and then the Grand Prix. For the second Grand Prix, the idea was to have a pre-tensing, including some strength work. I think most of you will know Sri Shankar, our long jumper, and Sri Shankar, for example, every day before a competition likes to do some squats and some power cleans. Yeah? Not a lot, only maybe 1 or 2 sets with 2 repetitions, but just to get the feeling of positive energy in his body and to pre-tense his muscles. And then the third strategy again was to do pre-tensing 2 days before the competition, just to see how the athletes are reacting. And when it comes to the main competition, for example, the Open Nationals or the Federation Cup in this case, yeah, then you can choose, okay, which of these strategies actually work the best? And that's the one you stick to at least for the rest of this season. But again, in the next season then, since your training might have changed, you will have to recheck what is the best tapering and peaking strategy for your athletes. Okay, that's it for today. I hope we've been able to clarify some of your questions. But yeah, I think Mr. Adila wants to talk now, and afterwards we can definitely...
Thank you, Alper. Thank you very much. Yesterday I took overall general thing, but you explained very much of on microcycle, what all the things to be done and not to be done. Now I request my president, Sri Adisu Mariwala sir, you like to add something?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Volker and Radha. I think it's very important. There's a lot of thoughts in people's minds what is the scientific way to taper off on the microcycle. And I think today's discussion has very clearly outlined how one should be tapering off to peak for the competition. There was a very interesting slide on what somebody like Asafa Powell would do. Doesn't mean you have to copy it, but it gives you an overall idea of how to taper down. And I think that's very important. The other thing is taking load, how the load should be distributed within the microcycle, I think is very, very important. Something that in my time we never knew. So there is so much new knowledge which is available within the whole ecosystem of sports. These are new. Maybe they were there at that time, but we never knew about it. Probably they were not there. There's a lot of research happening. I am on the development commission of World Athletics, and there is lots and lots of research that we are putting across to figure out what is the best for the athletes, what is the best for their health, what is the best for their training, what is the best for their well-being, to get high-level performance yet protect the athlete, because protecting the athlete is the most important thing as far as World Athletics is concerned. The athlete comes first. We don't want performance at the risk of the athlete. So there is lots and lots of research which is going on. We are restarting a lot more research than that was happening, and that is one of the things I have asked that I'm going to try and push, because I think science and research is the bedrock, of training. I keep saying sports is science. Unless you can understand biomechanics, biochemistry, how lactate will move, how your nervous system will react, it's all science. And no two people are same, so you can't use the same workout for two people. So that is the smartness of the coach. I mean, Asafa Powell's coaches put it down. But can Usain Bolt follow the same principle? No. His body is different. His brain is different. His nervous system is different. So that is where your coaching techniques come in. And that is where you have to analyze your own athlete and figure out what is the best for your own athlete. So good luck. Use your brains a little more. Think through the whole thing. Put the science that you are learning, put it into practice. And I'm sure that India will produce great champions, because you are the future coaches, and we depend on you to prepare our champions. So good luck and continue the good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now, welcome. We can start with the questions, because I think I'm expecting a lot of questions, because this area is very much important in sports training. And I see so many questions, so you can start with the question and answering.
I hope that Adil is able to spare 2 to 3 hours each day to start coaching again too.
I wish I could. I would love that. But you know, there are coaches who give written workouts and ask athletes to do. But I would not coach if I did not go to the ground and see what the athlete was doing, how the athlete was feeling, whether the athlete was feeling sluggish, whether the athlete was feeling good, whether the athlete was feeling tired, and I would modify my workout accordingly. So I don't have the time with World Athletics, with the IAAF, with AFI, IOA, and my work which puts food on the table. I don't have the time, and that is one of the reasons why I stopped coaching. So good luck to those who are.
Yeah. Thank you.
Many. I think there are very clever coaches there. From some of the questions that I understand, there are some excellent people out there, and I hope that they are the next generation. I am a senior citizen now. They are the next generation. So it's they who have to do whatever needs to be done now and keep the Indian flag flying high.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. We have a lot of young and very motivated coaches. At the same time, we have several experienced coaches. And I think what's really important for us all around the country is that we start talking to each other, that we discuss a bit more about the methods, and that we share our knowledge. And you've probably seen over the last 5 weeks, you know, there are no secrets any longer in the world of sports science. And I think it's our duty together to raise the level of Indian athletics. And once again, I'm very, very confident that India or AFI, that we will be able to develop a couple of medalists at the international stage within the next years. But it won't work without your support. So let's jump straight into the question session. Rajmohan, Mr. Radhakrishnan. Yeah, there's one question, for example, after technique training, can we go for speed training? Yes, we've mentioned that you should not conduct more than 2 units within one session, but I think having some technique work before having a speed session, that's definitely possible. Just avoid doing the wrong kind of technique. Yeah, so you should definitely do running drills, technique drills for acceleration or maximum running before conducting a speed session. But I would, for example, not combine a technique session for the hurdles with a speed session, because we have 2 different motor patterns here. Some jumpers, they like to do some technique training followed by maybe 1 or 2 30-meter flying runs. I think that's fine as well. But we always have to ensure that there are no negative effects. Yeah, if you want to develop technique in the beginning, it should be related to the speed work you're doing afterwards. It makes no sense if you're developing the body or the central nervous system into 2 different directions.
Good morning, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful session. Sir, can you explain the recovery sessions, sir? How to analyze the recovery sessions? You told that the 3:1, 2:1 ratios, and how the coaches should analyze the recovery sessions. What are the workouts should be given during the recovery sessions?
Yeah, during a recovery session, the idea is actually to rest. Yeah, that means a recovery session should definitely not affect the central nervous system. And recovery sessions are of particular importance after a lactic session, because during these lactic sessions, you know, there are some products in our body which limit the ability to recover. So if you increase the blood flow, if you increase the heart rate, it will help the body to shorten the recovery time, because they're getting rid of this so-called waste products. Not necessarily just lactic acid itself, but there are a couple of other aspects or things in our body which we want to get rid of, again, to reduce the recovery time. So recovery session for me mainly consists of extensive tempo runs. That means below 70-80% without producing any lactic acid. To again increase the blood flow, you can do some core strength training. I would also, what we've realized also in the national camps, what personally I don't really see a need to do that, and we've had a couple of discussions during our coaching courses already regarding this. In India, it's very common to have warm-up sessions. Yeah, instead of giving half a day rest to the athletes, the coaches ask the athletes, okay, do a short warm-up in the morning. And I have not yet met a coach who was able to explain me what the purpose of such a session is. So the best way to recover is actually to sleep or to stay in the bed. So maybe refrain from having these warm-up sessions if there's no need to do them. Yeah, just skip them. The best way to recover is to rest. Sometimes, again, an active rest, but that includes then some tempo runs. You can combine it with development of aerobic capacity. But please reconsider and refrain from this warm-up sessions where you just ask your athletes to come to the track, to do some core, to do some striding. It does not help you at all. Yeah, and I really believe, because remember, less is more, that we should stop having these warm-up sessions if they're not fulfilling a specific purpose.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, another question is regarding, you mentioned about the special and specific preparation. Is there a difference between a special and specific preparation, sir?
Yeah, specific preparation is even more specific than the special preparation. Yeah, it depends. That's mainly for the experienced athletes with a higher training age, because these athletes usually they have a slightly shorter general preparation. So instead of a junior athlete can easily have 8, sometimes 12 weeks of general preparation, because you have to focus on the fundamental aspects. Yeah, basic speed, basic strength, whatever. If the athletes are growing, if you're talking about a 20-year, 24-year-old athlete, they don't need that much foundational work any longer if they have not experienced early specialization. Yeah? So it's even more important that we do the right things at the right time with the younger athletes. But if you have an athlete at the performance stage, yeah, with a very strong base, they don't need to have such a long general preparation. So instead of maybe 12 weeks or 8 weeks, often they cut it down to 4 weeks or even 8 weeks. And then they can start the spatial preparation a bit earlier. But since we want to have this variety in training, we probably have like a 6 or 8 week special preparation, followed by a 4 weeks specific preparation, which is already a bit more intensive than the special preparation, but not yet a pre-competition phase. Yeah, so it's just a way to extend the specific aspects. For example, with Coach Ramesh, I've had a long discussion about duty chance preparation, and she was in an excellent shape for the indoor season, which unfortunately got cancelled. But since she has a very good strength level or base of strength, you know, we decided that she does not need such a long general preparation. So Coach Ramesh decided, okay, we only go for 4 weeks of general preparation, if we just work on fundamentals, a bit of endurance work. But immediately afterwards, after 4 weeks, they switched to special preparation to focus on more important aspects, as maximum strength, some eccentric strength exercises. And then after another 6 weeks, they went for specific preparation followed by the pre-competition. So again, the specific preparation is just for experienced senior athletes at a performance stage to enable them to have a higher volume of specific training and at the same time to keep a certain variety up.
Thank you, sir. Sir, next question is regarding the overload and how we can identify the overload of an athlete.
Yeah, I think it's not that easy. Of course, if you're dealing with an endurance athlete, often you have these symptoms of fatigue that an athlete gets a bit white face color. In the sprints, yeah, I think you have to, or the jumps, the throws, you have to carefully observe your athlete as well in training. Often, you know, if they have to tie their laces regularly during training sessions, this might already be an indicator that the athletes are tired. If they're not motivated, if they're probably losing appetite, these are all factors which are indicating that the athletes are slightly overtrained. But most importantly, again, I think is this training diary of the athletes. That you regularly, once a day or after every session and in the morning, that you ask them to write down how they feel, how is their mood, how is their subjective recovery state, how do they perceive, how do they perceive the session? Yeah, how would they rate the quality of the sessions? And again, if you have this diary and you have this RPE, you have the mood, you have the amount of sleep they get, the quality of the session, usually you can find over time that it's following these waveforms. And if you see that the form is going down, 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 you directly know, okay, obviously you're training too much. And unfortunately, and I think that's a mistake, every coach all around the world, they have experienced, often as coaches, we have a tendency to do too much. And again, less is more, especially the younger coaches, you know, be often a bit too encouraged, too motivated. And that means in the beginning of a coaching career, it happens quite a lot that we are conducting too many sessions and that we are actually overtraining the athletes. And with experience, if you're coaching for a few years at a certain level, I'm pretty sure we'll get this understanding as well.
Nagesh, you have any questions, Nagesh?
Volker, there is a question from participant. What is the difference between? Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
What is the difference between specific and special training? Specific phase and special phase.
Yeah, that's what we discussed 2 minutes ago.
Again, somebody is asking that.
Sir, can you unmute? Sir, can you unmute?
There is another question. Can you explain again the science behind effective session in morning, speed training followed by evening strength training mentioned?
Sorry, I did not understand the question.
Can you explain the speed training in the morning followed with the maximum training in the evening?
Maximum.
Yeah, I would never combine maximum speed training or maximum velocity training. That means like 30-meter flying, for example, and maximum strength, because there's always a high risk of injuries, even if you conduct it within the same microcycle. If you combine acceleration, I would say until 45 meters with maximum strength training, that's actually quite common. Yeah, so that's a very common training method to do acceleration work in the morning followed by maximum strength in the afternoon.
Thank you.
Sir, Nagesh, any questions? Nagesh?
Yeah, like that. There is a question for like for speed development. There is any for speed development. There is any specific value for like different events like 100 meter to 1500, 5000 for pure speed.
Yeah, this is regarding the speed training. I think we've mentioned already, and please have a look into the presentation on speed training, that speed training should always be shorter than 6 to 7 seconds. Otherwise, it becomes a speed endurance session. Rajmohan, any?
Sir, I have 2-3 questions more, sir. Please explain 9 days microcycle and 6 days of regeneration and 6 days of microcycles and 9 days of regenerations. The question is asked by Dr. R. Natarajan.
Yeah, I think this is a misunderstanding of the level 1 IWF coaches educational slides. There is an idea to have not a 7-day microcycle, but to use 6 or 9 days instead, because this might help you to provide more recovery to the athletes. Personally, I would not do that, because if you're not dealing with a professional athlete who is a full-time athlete who does not have to consider weekends or family time or university or work requirements, then it's fine to do that. But in general, I would always stick to the 7-day microcycle. The idea is if you have a 9-day microcycle, for example, that you can have more rest in between. If you have a 7-day microcycle, usually you have 6 days of training followed by a Sunday, which is a day off. In a 9-day microcycle, for example, you can have 4 days of training followed by 1 day off, 3 days of training followed by 1 day off. So the relative amount of recovery will be slightly increased. But again, I feel this is a bit, it's a bit made up and not really applicable to most of our athletes.
Sir, one more question is there. Is the speed training for 100 meters and 1500 meters is same?
Yes, if you want to develop speed, yeah, we have to focus on the pure speed, and that again means you have to stay below 6 or 7 seconds. There is one major difference And this is that usually the long distance runners or middle distance runner, they have a lesser amount of fast twitch muscle fibers. And that means the athletes are not able to reach such a high intensity. If you're not able to reach such a high intensity, you can actually use slightly shorter rest lengths. So you might have the same speed workout, let's say 4 times 30 meter flying or 5 times 30 meter flying. For a sprinter or long jumper, it's required to give them maybe 10, 12 minutes of rest. For a distance athlete, maybe 6 or 8 minutes are enough. Again, because they don't have such a huge amount of fast twitch fibers, it means their running intensity will be slightly lower in comparison to the one of a sprinter or jumper.
Thank you, sir. Another question is strength training. Please explain the difference between intramuscular and intermuscular exercises.
Yeah, this is also something you can find in our presentation of the strength training. Intramuscular just means that the different alpha motor neurons and the attached muscle fibers are working together with each other. Intermuscular means that the muscles in between the body are working together. Yeah, intra means in between, inside, intra means in between. Yeah, remember the interstate and intra-state would be when the different districts, for example, are working together within one state.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. Sir, any questions left out with you, sir?
I think almost all the questions have been answered. Now, I think, Walter, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think we are good. If there are any more questions, yeah, please feel free to write us at education@indianathletics.in. By today, latest by tomorrow, we will also upload all the remaining presentations. And tomorrow, yeah, at 10 o'clock, but I think we will talk about this. We will also have a question answering, including all or most of the lecturers here who participated in the last 5 days. So they will all be here for you and share some of their secrets. So please join us tomorrow for the last session at 10 a.m. again. And yeah, that's it from my side. I think it was a very fruitful time, even though tiring. We all deserve some recovery now. I hope to see you tomorrow. Yeah, for the final conclusion, we will also elaborate a bit more on the exam by tomorrow. So yeah, I see you tomorrow for the last session. You have a good day ahead. Get some rest and bye.
Thanks, Walter. I once again thank you, all participants. In addition to that, the Vice President of Bangladesh, Mr. Farooq Islam, and the Secretary General, Mr. Abdur Rukhin, Advocate, and all the participants from the SAF countries and from Malaysia. Thank you so much. Thank you being with us. Now I request Mr. Kamal Ali Khan to take over this session. I'm making you as host for your further proceeding. Thank you all.